Chatlink Nathan Barlow arrived in Arizona under a cloudless sky, and the kind of dry, oppressive heat that seemed to silence everything around it. He drove a silver Toyota Corolla rented from Phoenix Sky Harbor just 2 days earlier. His destination wasn't tourist-heavy or scenic. It was remote, a roadside motel in a town that barely registered on most maps, Red Pine, Arizona. Population 1,204. The kind of place where time moved slower, where gas stations still had analog pumps, and where people noticed unfamiliar faces. But Nathan wasn't here for sightseeing. He had one reason for coming: to chase ghosts in the desert. At 32, Nathan had built a quiet but loyal following for his podcast Signal Lost, a deep-dive true crime show exploring unsolved disappearances. He wasn't flashy. He didn't use jump cuts or spooky music. His delivery was calm, his tone deliberate. What made his show different was how deeply he embedded himself into the cases. He didn't just report them, he lived them. Traveled to the last known location, interviewed the forgotten family members, wandered into dead zones where others had gone missing. This time, he was looking into a string of disappearances that dated back decades: 3 hikers in 1994, a father and daughter in 2003, and a trucker in 2011, all lost within the same 50-mile stretch of Arizona wilderness. Locals called it Deadline Gulch, though the name didn't appear on any official map. It was the kind of mystery that consumed Nathan, and when he checked into room 6 at the Dusty Pines Motel, he was on the verge of what he believed could be a breakthrough. He signed in just after 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. The desk clerk remembered him as soft-spoken but focused, carrying a black duffel bag and a Pelican case filled with recording gear. He declined housekeeping for the week, said he'd be recording. He requested a corner room, ground floor, far from the road. No visitors, no noise. When asked how long he planned to stay, he paused and said, "Depends what I find." The next morning, the cleaning crew knocked on room 6 around 11:30 a.m. No answer. The Do Not Disturb sign was still hanging from the knob. By early evening, the motel manager noticed something strange. The car in the lot, a rental with out-of-state plates, hadn't moved. Nathan hadn't been seen since check-in, no sign of movement inside the room. By day 3, suspicion turned into concern. A spare key was used to enter. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. His laptop was still open on the small desk, the screen black. His microphone was positioned on the nightstand, recorder blinking. The black duffel sat untouched at the foot of the bed. His wallet, ID, and cash were on the dresser. Keys on the floor by the door. The motel called local law enforcement, who initially treated it as a case of a man who'd simply walked away. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no visible struggle. Officers noted that Nathan's personal items didn't appear hastily abandoned. His water bottle was half full, a notepad had fresh scribbles from the night before, and the bed was still made. His phone was gone. That raised questions. Did he take it with him? Did he leave voluntarily? Or was it taken? Officers canvassed the area, spoke with the other 8 guests at the motel. No one heard or saw anything unusual. One elderly couple recalled a car door closing late that night, but didn't look outside. Red Pine police sent a missing persons alert out statewide. They also reached out to Nathan's family in California. His sister, Julia, hadn't heard from him in 3 days, which was rare. She told detectives Nathan was meticulous. He didn't vanish. He scheduled every minute of his research trips and always checked in, if not with her, then with his producer. He had no history of mental illness, no drug use, and no reason to disappear. The podcast community took notice within days. Reddit threads speculated wildly. Some believed Nathan staged the disappearance for publicity, citing the eerie thematic tie-in with his podcast's title. Others believed he was silenced because he got too close to something dangerous. Julia rejected both theories. She knew him too well. He wouldn't abandon the story, she told reporters. Not like this, and not without a goodbye. By the end of the first week, the local sheriff's office turned the case over to state investigators. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They searched the surrounding brush and dirt roads, but picked up nothing. Nathan's scent ended behind the motel, near a gravel service road that led toward the desert. Surveillance cameras at the motel were outdated. Only one worked, and it didn't face the parking lot. No nearby businesses had coverage. Nathan's disappearance quickly went national. The podcast's listenership tripled overnight. News crews set up outside the dusty pines. But with no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses, and no digital breadcrumbs, the case stalled. His phone never pinged again. His bank accounts showed no activity. His car, laptop, and ID remained untouched. It was as if the desert swallowed him whole. But inside that motel room, on that blinking recorder, was an unfinished audio file. 5 seconds of silence. Then the faint sound of breath. And then static. And that would be the last anyone heard from Nathan Barlow, not until 19 years later, when a tape recorder whispered the final line. Detectives assigned to Nathan Barlow's case began with the most basic questions. Who was he running from, and why had he disappeared without a trace? But the more they peeled back, the more unsettling the silence became. Nathan had no enemies, at least none anyone knew of. No criminal record, no psychiatric history. Nothing in his past raised any red flags, not even a parking ticket in the last decade. His closest friends described him as driven, self-contained, and deeply methodical. His sister Julia, still in shock, told investigators he was the last person who would vanish without a reason. They turned to his podcast, Signal Lost. Nathan had built it piece by piece over the last 5 years, gaining a modest but loyal audience. His episodes covered unsolved cases, missing persons, and strange disappearances across the American Southwest. He wasn't a sensationalist. He relied on public records, interviews, and ground-level investigation. He was respected in the true crime community for staying factual, staying human. There was no scandal, no controversy, and nothing that screamed danger, until they looked at the last thing he ever uploaded. The final episode dropped just after 10:30 p.m., less than 12 hours before he was reported missing. It was titled Deadline Gulch, Part 1. The introduction was standard, Nathan's voice calm, analytical, walking listeners through the backstory of a trio of missing hikers from 1994. He made references to local legends, official search logs, and discrepancies in police statements. Halfway through, he hinted at finding something new, something that might break this thing open. But the recording never reached its conclusion. At precisely 23 minutes and 42 seconds, Nathan's voice cut off. No goodbye, no sign-off, no closing music, just a blunt end, mid-sentence. The upload metadata showed the file had been truncated but not edited. The raw WAV file from his recorder matched the uploaded version. It wasn't a glitch, that was all he recorded. Detectives combed through the rest of the equipment left in room 6. His laptop had a series of local maps, scanned case files, and half-written notes, nothing obviously incriminating. A hard drive held backups of older interviews and audio drafts. There was one item not listed on the original motel inventory, a compact voice recorder wedged between the nightstand and bed frame. It had been overlooked during the first walkthrough. The recorder contained a single file, time-stamped 12:08 a.m., the night Nathan vanished. It began with ambient room noise, the faint hum of the air conditioner, a chair creaking, a low sigh. Then Nathan's voice, muffled, close to the mic. I think someone followed me. A pause, the sound of breathing, papers being moved, another chair scrape. I heard it again, outside. Same sound, like a footstep on gravel, just once. Then nothing. There was a shift in tone, less like a host, more like a man talking to himself. If I'm wrong, I'll delete this. But if I'm right, if something happens, check the gulch, check what's under the tower. It's not a story. It was never just a story. Then, 5 seconds of absolute silence, followed by a sharp intake of breath and static. The file ended there. No further audio, no signs of tampering. Investigators sent the recording to forensic audio specialists in Phoenix. They enhanced the background and confirmed the noise pattern. There was a distinct scuff outside the room, possibly gravel being stepped on just before the exhale. The static wasn't random either. It had a rhythmic pulse, like an interference pattern, not consistent with a failing device. A new theory began to take shape. Nathan had either been targeted by someone who knew what he was researching, or he believed he had. But if someone entered the room, there was no sign of forced entry. No second set of fingerprints, no foreign DNA. Everything inside that motel room suggested isolation, no struggle, no intrusion. Nathan had simply vanished. Phone records led nowhere. His last known call had been to a local landline, an outdated number for a decommissioned ranger station that had been closed since 2009. Text logs showed nothing suspicious, and his GPS trail ended right at the motel. No drive afterward, no exit ping. They searched for surveillance footage again. The motel's only working camera faced the front office, not the parking lot, not the hallway. A nearby gas station had one camera, but the footage was overwritten every 48 hours. By the time police arrived, it was already gone. Still, there was no evidence of voluntary disappearance. No packed bags, no bank withdrawals, no travel bookings, no deleted accounts. His email, podcast revenue, and social media had been untouched. Julia confirmed he'd planned to return home the following week. He had dinner plans, rent due, a dentist appointment. Life was still in motion. There was no trace of exit. When they showed Julia the recording, the last known voice message from her brother, she broke down. Not because of what he said, but how he said it. "He sounded afraid," she whispered, "and Nathan doesn't get afraid." Investigators added it to the official file. It became the last documented proof that Nathan Barlow had been alive in that motel room. After that, there was nothing, just a sigh. Then static. And whatever was waiting outside that door. As investigators retraced Nathan Barlow's steps, a picture of growing obsession began to emerge. Friends and former colleagues painted a version of him that was subtly different from the composed, meticulous podcast host the public had come to know. He hadn't unraveled, not exactly, but something in him had shifted in the months leading up to his disappearance. He'd stopped covering a variety of cases. Instead, he focused almost exclusively on one. The 1994 disappearance of 3 hikers along an isolated ridgeline in southern Arizona, known to locals as Deadline Gulch. The hikers, 2 college students and their local guide, had vanished without a trace while backpacking through what was supposed to be a well-documented section of federal land. There had been an extensive search, even national media coverage at the time. But no bodies were ever recovered, just a single backpack found wedged between boulders miles from the trail, its contents intact. The official narrative concluded that the trio likely succumbed to heat stroke and got lost. But there were discrepancies, search timelines that didn't match, witness accounts that were never followed up, and radio logs that disappeared from the ranger station's archive. Nathan had started pulling at those threads. In the last 6 months before he vanished, he mentioned Deadline Gulch in nearly every podcast episode, even when the subject had nothing to do with the area. He dug into old ranger dispatches, purchased vintage topographic maps, and filed FOIA requests that yielded little. He'd traveled to Arizona 3 times before the final trip. Each time, he stayed longer, talked to fewer people, and came back more withdrawn. One friend recalled a conversation where Nathan, half-joking, said, "It's like the place eats people, and nobody wants to talk about it." Authorities began to consider the uncomfortable possibility that Nathan had become a threat to someone. If the original investigation into the hiker's disappearance had been corrupted or covered up, then reopening old wounds could have made him a target. But there was no concrete evidence of foul play. No notes, no threats, no confrontations. Just that growing fixation and a vanishing that mirrored the very story he was trying to tell. The digital forensic team made a breakthrough with Nathan's phone records. Though the device had never been recovered, cell tower data captured one final ping, hours after Nathan checked into the motel. It came from a narrow section of wilderness roughly 17 miles south of Red Pine. The area had no residences, no maintained roads, just an old mining trail that hadn't been serviced in years. The GPS coordinate landed near a bend in a dry wash, an area bordered by shale ridges and abandoned fencing. Locals claimed the trail once led to a ranger outpost, but it had long since collapsed or been reclaimed by desert. A search team was dispatched within 24 hours. They brought dogs, drones, and tracking teams. For days, they combed the dry ravines and sun-scorched mesas, but they found nothing. No signs of tire tracks, no footprints, no scent trails for the dogs to follow. The last GPS ping had given them hope, finally something physical to work from, but it evaporated like everything else. The search was quietly scaled down after the 5th day. Internally, many began to admit that they weren't even sure what they were looking for anymore. What unsettled investigators most was how perfectly the trail mirrored the original 1994 case. The hikers, too, had been last seen near a trailhead that seemed well-traveled, but quickly bled into wilderness. Their last known communication had come through a brief radio check-in at a point just 4 miles from where Nathan's GPS had last transmitted. The coincidence was hard to ignore. Same terrain, same disappearance, same silence. Nathan's sister, Julia, returned to Arizona that week. She refused to believe her brother would willingly disappear into a place he'd spent years trying to expose. She walked parts of the trail herself, accompanied by local guides, retracing the same path that had swallowed her brother. What struck her wasn't just the isolation, it was the absence of noise. No birds, no wind, just a stillness that pressed in from all sides. When she met with the lead detective assigned to the case, she brought something he hadn't seen yet, an audio file Nathan had sent her days before he vanished. It was meant to be a teaser for the next Signal Lost episode, but Nathan never released it publicly. In the file, his voice was measured but urgent. "There's something wrong with how that case was handled," he said. "Too many missing documents, too many people suddenly unavailable. If I don't make it back, it wasn't the heat. It wasn't an accident. It was because I got close to the signal they tried to bury." Investigators didn't know what to make of it. There was no proof that anyone in law enforcement was involved in a cover-up. But Nathan's words lingered, especially when compared to the trail of inconsistencies he left behind. Was it paranoia? Or had he finally uncovered something that someone didn't want public? They cataloged every inch of his research, dozens of notebooks, USB drives, and printed documents. A recurring phrase kept appearing in the margins: "Follow the ridge, not the trail." It wasn't clear what he meant. No one knew if it was metaphorical or geographic. The maps offered no clue. The ridges around the gulch were fractured, disjointed, crumbling, like the case itself. And so, once again, the investigation ended where it began, in the wind, in the dust, on a nameless ridge in the middle of nowhere where 3 hikers disappeared, and where Nathan Barlow followed. But unlike those before him, Nathan left behind a voice, one still searching for the signal. Inside Nathan Barlow's apartment, nothing appeared ransacked. No broken locks, no missing electronics. But as investigators worked their way through the narrow space, something immediately stood out. Along one side of the living room wall, stacked meticulously on a pinewood shelf, were nearly 24 cassette tapes. Old school, labeled by hand, some marked with dates, others with names. A few were simply labeled with numbers. They weren't part of his podcast archives. These weren't meant for public release. These were raw, private, unfiltered. One tape stood out. Its label was almost worn off, as if it had been handled more than the rest. Faded black ink read, "Deputy M.R. 94/deadline." Investigators listened to it in full. The voice on the other end was raspy, breathless at times, and hard to place. The man identified himself only once. Mitch Rayner, Cochise County Sheriff's Office, retired. He was the deputy first on scene when the 3 hikers went missing in 1994. Nathan's voice came in, softly, asking routine questions. When, where, who searched, what they found. But the tone shifted halfway through the recording. Mitch grew erratic, paranoid. He spoke of gaps in the report. Teams being pulled back too early, equipment failures, a ranger who went missing for 6 hours during the original search, never logged in the official files. Then came the part that froze the room. "They said it wasn't our job anymore, told me to stop asking. Next day, the captain got reassigned. 2 months later, the whole thing was boxed up and locked down. You don't get it, son. They don't want it reopened. This ain't just a cold case, it's a closed door. Locked from the outside." Nathan didn't push. He let the silence speak. Then Mitch spoke again, lower this time. "If I disappear, you tell them I didn't do it to myself." The tape ended there. No sign-off, no timestamp, just static. Detectives ran the name. Mitch Rayner had indeed worked in Cochise County in the early 90s, but retired shortly after the hiker case. His name barely appeared in the official files. Just one reference in a call log. No interviews, no follow-up. It was as if his involvement had been erased. But public records showed that 3 days after Nathan recorded the interview, Mitch Rayner was found dead in his garage. Ruled a suicide. Gunshot wound. No note. At first, the connection was considered circumstantial. But then investigators checked Nathan's email history. In the 2 weeks before his disappearance, Nathan had sent out multiple inquiries to retired rangers, local journalists, and geotechnical researchers, people connected, either directly or through research, to Deadline Gulch. Most of the messages were straightforward, requests for interviews, questions about old radio towers, but one email sent to a retired Arizona field technician stood out. It was a single sentence. What happens when you dig too deep into a dead signal? None of the recipients responded. The question lingered. Was it metaphorical, technical, or a warning? Investigators followed the thread deeper. They reached out to the retired technician Nathan had emailed. The man, now living in Oregon, declined to speak at first. When finally contacted, his voice trembled. He didn't deny receiving Nathan's email. He just said, "I was hoping it was spam." Then he hung up. The deeper police went, the stranger the silences became. People who should have had nothing to hide refused to talk. Retired staff who had once worked near the gulch suddenly didn't recall the case. Others claimed they'd never heard of the hikers, even though newspaper archives proved otherwise. And each time a new door opened, it seemed to close just as quickly. Nathan's podcast producer, Jeremy Cole, told detectives he had no idea Nathan had found the deputy. "He didn't tell me about that tape," Jeremy said. "But he was different after that trip. He kept saying he was onto something real. But he wouldn't say what. He started using burner phones. He stopped emailing from his main account. That's when I knew something wasn't right." Detectives searched those burners. One was found in Nathan's nightstand, powered off. Inside it, a single text draft had been written but never sent. It read, "If this goes south, follow the interview. It's bigger than the hikers." That line shifted the narrative. Nathan hadn't just gone to Arizona to chase an old story. He believed the hiker disappearance was a symptom of something deeper, something obscured, not by time or accident, but by intent. Suddenly, the idea that Nathan had simply gone missing felt less plausible. Investigators began to explore whether he'd been targeted, whether someone had been watching, waiting, but there was no paper trail, no credit card transactions, no security footage, just a single voicemail left on Julia's phone 2 days before he vanished. It was short, a single sentence spoken quietly. "I think they found me." And then nothing. No return call. No voicemail metadata traceable. The number was unregistered, likely dialed through a signal masking app. Police couldn't even confirm it had come from Nathan, but Julia was certain. It was his voice. She'd grown up with it. By the end of the week, the suicide of Mitch Rayner was reopened, but without new physical evidence, it remained a cold echo. No shell casing recovered, no prints, just a deputy who'd warned he might be silenced, then died 3 days after speaking to Nathan Barlow. In the official investigation file, that tape is now marked Exhibit 7B, unverified interview, circumstantial linkage, no conclusive leads. But for those who've heard it, the message is clear. Nathan hadn't just stumbled into a case, he'd stepped into something that wanted to be left buried. After months of stalled progress and unanswered questions, Julia Barlow made a decision. She no longer believed the official investigation into her brother's disappearance would go anywhere. The police had done what they could, but the deeper the case went, the more it felt like it was being quietly buried. So she hired someone who wasn't bound by red tape or jurisdiction, a private investigator named Miles Keene. He was ex-law enforcement, had a reputation for finding people the system forgot, and most importantly, he didn't think Nathan just walked away. Keene started where the detectives had left off, the Dusty Pines Motel. He requested raw server logs from the motel's outdated surveillance system, hoping to extract anything the original team might have missed. Most of the files were corrupted, degraded over time, or poorly maintained. But in the logs, one entry stood out. At 1:16 a.m., the morning Nathan vanished, a remote IP address accessed the surveillance server. Not from the motel office, not from Red Pine. It had come from out of state, flagged through a VPN, and bounced through multiple proxies. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. And they were there for one reason. The video files between 11:48 p.m. and 2:12 a.m. had been deleted. Keene pressed further. Using enhanced image processing on archived low-res security snapshots, he isolated several time-stamped stills taken earlier that night, some of them cached automatically by the system. One showed a blurry figure near room 6 at 11:42 p.m., just 6 minutes before the footage cut out. The man appeared to be alone, wearing a hooded jacket. The image wasn't clear enough to confirm identity, but what stood out wasn't just his presence, it was that he hadn't checked in. The motel registry showed 9 guests the night Nathan vanished. Only 8 checked out. The 9th, room 4, remained untouched for days. No luggage, no trash, no sign of occupation, except for a key card that was never returned. That guest had paid in cash. No ID provided. The front desk hadn't even taken a license plate number. Keene pulled security footage from earlier in the day, this time from the gas station half a mile down the road. The footage, unlike the motels, was cloud-backed and time-stamped. At 3:14 p.m., it showed the same hooded man purchasing a pack of batteries and a prepaid phone. He never looked directly at the camera. Paid in cash again, left in a nondescript silver sedan with no front plate. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to change the tone. Julia turned over everything Keene found to the lead detective still assigned to Nathan's file. Forensics confirmed that the remote server access used sophisticated methods, far beyond what an average user could manage. The login originated through a remote administration protocol used in government and law enforcement systems. This wasn't just a tech-savvy civilian. Someone had deliberately accessed and wiped that surveillance footage using tools not publicly available. And they hadn't done it from Red Pine. The investigation team escalated the case internally. Now they weren't just looking at a disappearance, they were looking at an intentional digital cover-up. But even with this lead, there was still no movement on the ground. The man from the gas station was never identified. His image was shared with other agencies, but no matches were made. No license plates to track, no fingerprints. It was like he'd passed through, erased his trail, and vanished. Just like Nathan. The FBI was contacted but declined to formally open a case without new evidence tying the disappearance to interstate crime. The burden of proof stayed local. And once again, the trail slowed to nothing. Privately, Keene told Julia he didn't think this was random. He believed Nathan had uncovered something tied to Deadline Gulch, something that had scared someone into action. This wasn't just a missing person, he said. This was silencing, clean, precise, professional. But who had the motive, and what was Nathan getting close to? In his notes, recovered from his apartment, Nathan had circled 3 dates connected to the 1994 hiking case, each linked to missing ranger logs, deleted search records, or reassigned personnel. Below them, scribbled in his handwriting, "Not lost, removed." It became harder and harder to believe Nathan's disappearance was anything but intentional. Yet, without a body, without a clear crime scene, and without direct witness testimony, it remained what it always had been, an open case with missing pieces. Julia asked for the raw audio again, the one Nathan recorded before he vanished. She played it in full for the first time in weeks, not just to listen, but to search. Every breath, every background hum. She noticed something she hadn't before. Just before the exhale, barely audible, was a clicking sound. Rhythmic. Not natural. She played it on loop. 3 clicks, then a pause, 3 more. She didn't know what it meant, but it didn't feel like random noise. She sent the clip to Keene. He listened. Then he asked a single question. "Do you know what a dead key burst sounds like?" She didn't, but he did. It was a method used in covert communications, brief audio bursts embedded in static to transmit location codes or signal handshakes. Old tech, Cold War era, mostly defunct, mostly. Whatever Nathan had been recording that night, whatever he'd picked up just before everything went dark, it wasn't a glitch, it wasn't random, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one ever saw what happened next. But for Julia, one fact remained. Someone else had been at that motel, someone who came and left in silence, and whatever they brought with them didn't leave. The discovery came from a fan forum, an online thread buried deep in the community of listeners who refused to let Nathan Barlow's name disappear with the desert wind. A user known only by the handle VZ404 claimed to have accessed a backup cloud drive linked to Nathan's podcast production software. The account had been inactive for months. No one had the password, but apparently the recovery email was still live. And buried within the autosave drafts was a file that had never been released to the public. It was dated just 3 days before Nathan vanished. The file name read EP_deadline gulch _rough cut _final. But what caught attention was the embedded subtitle, Interview with a Survivor. At first, authorities dismissed it as a fan theory, but when the audio was reviewed, it was very clearly Nathan's voice. He sounded cautious, almost hesitant, nothing like his usual composed on-mic tone. The intro was fragmented. He talked about a man named Marcus, someone he described as a former radio technician who had worked near the Deadline Gulch perimeter in the early 90s. Nathan claimed Marcus had been stationed at a now decommissioned relay site that monitored shortwave frequencies for weather and geological data. But Marcus told him something else, something not in any report, that the disappearances always followed a signal. Nathan spoke in clipped sentences, trying to describe what Marcus had shown him, a series of narrow-band shortwave bursts that appeared in the region on irregular cycles, strong enough to be picked up on analog receivers, always brief, always clean, and always followed, within days, by someone going missing. He called it the desert pulse. Nathan said Marcus believed it wasn't a glitch or interference, but an intentional transmission, that someone or something was testing reach, scanning for movement or signaling an event. The episode cuts off at exactly 17 minutes and 19 seconds. No sign-off, no music, just silence. Audio forensics confirmed the file had once been longer. The final 3 minutes were overwritten, not just edited, but deliberately deleted. Metadata analysis recovered the original track name, Interview with Marcus.wav. It had been there. Someone had removed it. Police tracked the file's upload source to a secondary cloud server tied to a burner email registered in New Mexico. But through file-sharing pings and background sync logs, they uncovered an IP address associated with a rural broadband tower near the Arizona-New Mexico border. It was an area with no known residents for 20 miles, except for one, Marcus Delaros, age 71. No current address, no social footprint, no driver's license renewal since 2006. But buried in a parcel record was his name, listed as the last registered owner of a small plot once used for telecommunications infrastructure. It had been purchased by the federal government in 1992, then decommissioned in 2000. Delaros never officially transferred ownership, no taxes, no foreclosure, nothing. It took a week to locate the land. Investigators described the location as nearly unreachable. The trail leading to it was overgrown, the terrain uneven, but at the end was a rusting trailer, an old radio tower lying on its side, and a makeshift antenna still wired to a generator. There was no running water, no electricity, aside from what the panels and batteries supplied. They knocked on the door. No response. Eventually, Marcus emerged from behind the trailer, thin, long-bearded, with sun-damaged skin. He didn't ask who they were. He only said, "If you're looking for Nathan, I told him not to come back." At first, Marcus denied the interview, said Nathan misrepresented what they discussed, said he didn't want to be part of anything public. But when pressed with the recording's content and the fact that someone had deliberately deleted it, his tone changed. He asked if the file had reached anyone else. When told it had, he looked away and said only, "Then it's too late." Marcus eventually agreed to speak under the condition that nothing would be recorded. He confirmed meeting Nathan. Confirmed showing him the frequency, logs, data Marcus had been collecting for decades, but he refused to explain what he believed the signals meant. He only said they weren't from any known transmitter, that they didn't behave like reflections or bursts. They had patterns, time, location, spacing. He'd seen it all before, in 1994, in 2003, in 2011. He had a hand-drawn chart with dates and map coordinates, each marked near the ridge where the original hikers went missing. Each date matched a known case. When asked why he never came forward, Marcus looked exhausted. He said people had tried. A colleague in 1996, a ranger in 2003, both ended up dead within a year. "It doesn't matter how careful you are," he said. "Once you listen long enough, something listens back." He didn't elaborate. Detectives left with no tape, no signed statement, and no legal grounds to hold Marcus. But they now had something else. Coordinates. A remote quadrant of desert between two geological fault lines. Nathan had circled the same area on a map recovered from his car. A place he'd never visited publicly. A place he was possibly heading to before he disappeared. Back at headquarters, the audio file was added to the case folder, but it was redacted from official release. The last 3 minutes remained unrecovered. When a Freedom of Information request was filed months later, the file was marked as incomplete. Online, the sleuths called it the redacted episode, a piece of a mystery that was almost solved, but buried, again, in silence. Whatever Nathan had uncovered about Marcus, the signal, or the gulch, someone made sure the final proof would never reach the light, but one name remained in the system, buried deep in the metadata: Marcus. The visit to Marcus Delarose hadn't given investigators the clarity they were hoping for. If anything, it left them with more questions and a deeper sense that whatever Nathan Barlow had stumbled into went far beyond a missing persons case. Marcus never directly admitted to anything. He never claimed to know what happened to Nathan, but what he did share hinted at something larger, older, and far more unsettling. He told them about a radio monitoring project he'd worked on in the early 1990s. Officially, it was a routine environmental study, conducted under contract with a federal agency Marcus refused to name. They were tasked with logging radio frequencies across low-population desert regions to identify natural interference patterns and signal reflections. At least, that's what they were told, but it didn't take long for Marcus to notice something that didn't fit. At random intervals, always short bursts, and never on the same frequency twice, strange transmissions would cut through the static. Not voices, not music, just a patterned clicking, sometimes in sets of 3s, sometimes in 9s. The signals were always brief, under 15 seconds, but strong, not echoes, not bounce signals, and they always originated from the same rough quadrant of desert terrain just south of Deadline Gulch. Marcus began to log them in private. His colleagues ignored the signals, told him it was noise. But over time, Marcus noticed something else. Within 72 hours of those transmissions, there was almost always a disappearance reported in the surrounding region. Hikers, hunters, ranch hands, one time even a forest surveyor. Most were never found. A few were written off as heat exposure or animal attacks. But the dates lined up too often to be coincidence. When Marcus brought his concerns to his project lead, the response was immediate. He was reassigned without explanation. The monitoring station was shut down 2 weeks later. The hard drives were taken, logs destroyed. He was never contacted again. He left the agency and disappeared into off-grid life not long after, never fully understanding what he'd been a part of, but convinced it hadn't been about environmental research. When Nathan found him decades later, Marcus had already been listening again. The old transmitter had been reassembled. He told detectives he'd started picking up the same patterns again in 2011. Weaker, but still there. The same rhythmic sequences, the same aftermath. "You don't have to believe me," Marcus said. "Just track the disappearances. They're still happening, and your podcast boy was just the latest." He handed the detectives a small canvas-wrapped object. It was heavy and cold. Inside was a beat-up shortwave recorder, wrapped in foam and sealed with rubber bands. He told them not to open it until they were back in town. They followed that instruction. When they played the recording in the lab the next day, it was mostly static, a low hiss, and then, faint but deliberate, a voice, male, repeating a string of numbers, coordinates, over and over again. No variation, no inflection, just the same latitude and longitude, followed by a pause, and then static. The voice was unidentifiable, no known match in any law enforcement database. The file ended as abruptly as it began. The coordinates pointed to a point roughly 11 miles southeast of Deadline Gulch. No roads, no structures, just a rock shelf marked on some geological maps as Section 34. It had no trail access, no cell coverage, no human development of any kind. That's where the signal came from. That's where Marcus believed people were being taken. Or led. Detectives returned to Marcus's trailer 5 days later with a search warrant, hoping to learn more about the origin of the tape. What they found instead was charred debris. The trailer had been completely destroyed by fire. Investigators found no evidence of accelerant, suggesting it had been set from the inside using natural combustibles. There was no body, no footprints leaving the area, no tire tracks. Marcus Delarose had vanished, just like the people he spoke of. Authorities searched the property for days, no sign of him. Neighbors, if you could call them that, miles away, hadn't seen Marcus in years. His last recorded grocery delivery was from over 8 months prior. Whatever he was preparing for, he'd isolated himself completely. The burned remnants of his radio setup were pulled from the wreckage. Most of the equipment was beyond repair, but a single metal case, tucked behind a scorched section of the trailer wall, survived the fire. Inside were old notebooks, hand-drawn maps, signal logs, and marked calendar entries. Some dated back to 1994. The last entry was the day before the fire. 2 words. Heard it again. Police took it as confirmation. Whatever Marcus had been tracking wasn't just a memory. It had returned. Back in Red Pine, Julia Barlow was given the coordinates from the tape. She looked at the map in silence. It was nearly identical to the one Nathan had drawn by hand in his notes. They'd both circled the same place. They'd both heard the same pattern. And now, Marcus was gone too. Whatever Nathan had followed into the desert, he hadn't been the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The location marked by Marcus's recording wasn't on any tourist map. It wasn't even marked on most updated satellite imaging. But old federal documents confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. A now decommissioned relay station had once operated in that section of the Sonoran scrubland. Constructed in the late 1980s, it had functioned as a passive signal relay for regional radio communications, weather reports, ranger dispatches, and shortwave monitoring for seismic activity. It was taken offline in 2001, allegedly due to funding cuts and updated satellite systems. But its footprint remained. The approach wasn't easy. It required 4-wheel drive, precise GPS coordinates, and clearance from Bureau of Land Management officials who hadn't visited the site in decades. When investigators finally arrived, the structure stood partially collapsed, cinder block walls eroded by sand and heat, corrugated roof panels missing or scattered. But what immediately stood out was the evidence that someone had been there, recently. Tucked beneath wind-blocked corners were wrappers from protein bars, not sold before 2022. Empty water bottles stacked carefully beside a rusted generator, a set of boot prints, barely visible in the dust, that led toward the southern edge of the structure, and then stopped. Inside, much of the equipment had long since rusted. Control panels were stripped. The antenna tower, once rising 60 feet above the flat scrub, had collapsed in on itself. But the interior was dry, cooler, and tucked behind a false wall, a storage panel misaligned by just an inch. Investigators found something no one had expected. An old storeroom, locked from the outside. Once breached, it revealed boxes stacked to the ceiling, each one labeled in black marker, DLG 1994, REVIEW-archive, INT-unassigned. There were mugshots, dozens of them. Some of known individuals from the hiker case, but others didn't match any name in the case file, faces unconnected to the original investigation. There were newspaper clippings too, articles from obscure local papers covering disappearances that hadn't been officially linked to Deadline Gulch. Many of the articles had red marker slashes through them. Others had entire paragraphs blacked out, dates had been changed in pen, some names had been written over in shaky handwriting, crossed out, replaced. Detectives laid out the documents across the concrete floor. What they found wasn't a record of a case. It was an attempted rewriting. The logs had entries from search efforts that were never reported publicly, mentions of unverified sightings, radio call logs that conflicted with official dispatch timelines. And then, most disturbing of all, memos referencing containment measures and optics management. None of these matched anything from the Cochise County Sheriff's records. One box held reel-to-reel audio spools labeled only with dates. One of them matched the date of the 1994 disappearance. But when played, it wasn't a ranger call or a distress signal. It was a scrambled voice, looped in repeat, saying the same phrase over and over: "East of Ridge, hold 34, east of Ridge, hold 34. That voice wasn't part of any known emergency protocol. It didn't sound panicked. It sounded like an instruction. The implications were immediate and chilling. Had there been a parallel investigation no one knew about? A shadow operation meant to monitor or manipulate events in the Gulch? The presence of so many mismatched names and altered documents suggested something beyond clerical error. This wasn't disorganization. This was concealment. Back in Red Pine, Julia was briefed on what was found. Her first reaction wasn't anger. It was recognition. She had seen one of the names written in the altered records, handwritten in the margins of a photo next to the word "reviewed." It was the name of a man who had contacted Nathan months earlier, claiming to have information about ranger disappearances in the early 2000s. Nathan had tried to arrange a meeting. The man never showed. Days later, he was reported dead. An overdose, ruled accidental. Julia hadn't connected the dots until now. His name had been scrubbed from Nathan's production notes, but clearly Nathan hadn't deleted it. Someone else had. Authorities collected every document from the station. The site was sealed off. Quietly, federal agents were contacted to examine the authenticity of the materials. But the story never made the news. There was no press release, no public update. It was as if the case once again was being quietly absorbed into the shadows. One officer, speaking off the record, admitted that most of what they found couldn't be traced to any official chain of custody. No signatures, no author names, just markings, codes, and altered facts. "It's like someone tried to rewrite reality from inside that station," he said, and then they walked away. The relay logs, the ones not scorched or degraded, were packed and sent for analysis. One technician, during a routine cataloging, found a note slipped inside a folder. It was folded twice, yellowed from age, and written in all caps. "Don't trace the frequency, it traces you." No one could determine when it had been placed there, or by whom. Julia visited the relay site once before it was shut down completely. She stood in the center of the room where the documents had been found, staring at the boot prints that faded just inches from the exit. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. When asked what she was thinking, she simply said, "He found it." Whatever it was, he found it. And whatever it was, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure no one else ever would. Nathan hadn't walked away from the motel. He hadn't vanished by chance. He'd followed the trail. And the trail led here, into a room where facts had been buried, names rewritten, and time itself quietly erased. In April of 2024, after nearly 2 decades of sitting in bureaucratic limbo, the abandoned relay station south of Deadline Gulch was finally marked for demolition. A private contractor had been awarded the job, a simple tear-down, haul-out, and land clearance order filed under routine government infrastructure decommissioning. No mention of its history, no flag on the property's connection to an active missing persons investigation. Officially, it was just a ruin in the desert, rotting metal, cracked concrete, and dust. On the 3rd day of the demolition prep, one of the workers, a man named Miguel Alvarez, was removing wall panels in the sub-basement. The air was dense with mold and rust. It wasn't a space that had been mapped in the blueprints provided, but a corner section of drywall felt hollow. Behind it, wrapped in a deteriorated tarp and lodged between rusted studs, was a small, rectangular, waterproof container. It was coated in years of grit, but still intact. Miguel handed it off to the project foreman, who, recognizing the sensitive nature of the find, alerted the local sheriff's office. Inside the container was a mini cassette recorder, sealed in a plastic evidence bag and labeled only with a faded number written in red ink. The model was old, early 2000s, and heavily worn, but the serial number stamped on the underside matched one already recorded in the Nathan Barlow case file. It was the same model he'd used during his podcast fieldwork, the same type that had been found plugged into the motel's nightstand. For a brief moment, there was hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe, after all this time, there would be an answer. A technician with the sheriff's department carefully cleaned the heads and threaded the tape. The machine still worked. When it began to play, the room fell silent. It was Nathan's voice, clear, measured, calm. If you're hearing this, it means they didn't stop. There was a pause, breathing, then they moved the signal. Don't trust the coordinates, don't follow the noise. Another pause. The tape hissed faintly. I thought I understood it. Thought if I got close enough, if I traced it back to the source, it would all make sense, but it doesn't work like that. The closer you get, the less real it feels. The maps change, people forget, records go missing. Nathan's voice cracked slightly. He wasn't panicked, but there was something behind his words, a finality. They erased Marcus, they erased Mitch, and they're going to erase me. He inhaled slowly, then continued, softer this time. If you're listening, you're already too close. That's how it starts. You hear the pattern, you chase it, you think it's just a signal, just noise. But it's not. It watches who listens. Silence again. I left the last recording somewhere safe. I don't know if they'll find them. I don't even know what they mean anymore. Just, don't try to finish this. Don't try to find me. A click echoed in the background. Perhaps a switch or the door of the relay station creaking open. I don't think I ever left the motel. Then, static, unbroken. The tape ran for another 17 seconds before it finally stopped. For investigators, it was a surreal moment, a voice frozen in time, preserved underground for 19 years. The physical evidence confirmed what Julia Barlow had believed all along, that Nathan had made it to the relay station, that he'd seen something, recorded something, and deliberately hidden it before disappearing. But what he said raised more questions than answers. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know what it meant to move the signal. And they didn't know how Marcus and Mitch had been erased when both of their deaths, while suspicious, had already been written off by official records as suicide and accidental fire. The statement about the maps changing, about people forgetting, it sounded paranoid, delusional even. But after everything found in that basement, every falsified document and missing name, no one could dismiss the possibility that Nathan hadn't imagined it, that maybe he was describing something real, something systemic, something intentional. The tape was authenticated, sealed into evidence, and added to the case file, which, against internal pressure, remained open. Nathan's body had never been found. No forensic trace existed beyond the motel, the relay site, and now this tape. No financial activity, no digital footprint, no confirmed sightings. But in that final message, there was a moment, a sentence that haunted investigators and Nathan's family alike. I don't think I ever left the motel. To some, it was a metaphor, a sign of mental breakdown. But to those who had followed his case closely, from the shortwave recordings to the erased interviews to the way records warped around Deadline Gulch, it suggested something more troubling. That whatever had happened to Nathan didn't follow the normal rules of disappearance. That he might have been consumed by the very thing he was trying to expose, a signal not just transmitted, but designed to draw in the listener, and then take them. In the podcast community, the recording went viral, transcribed, analyzed, dissected. Thousands downloaded the audio within hours of it being leaked. Dozens claimed to hear new layers in the background, whispers, code, pulse waves, forums lit up with theories. Some believed Nathan had uncovered proof of a covert experiment. Others believed the signal was never human to begin with, but the official investigation didn't speculate. The report only said, audio recording recovered from site. Subject, Barlow, Nathan. Status, missing. Declared presumed dead. To this day, the full tape remains unreleased, stored in a sealed evidence locker marked Exhibit 10F. But those who've heard it remember one thing more than anything else: Nathan's voice, steady, calm, warning them not to listen, as if he knew, once you heard it, you couldn't forget it, and once it heard you, you didn't come back. The final seconds of the recovered tape weren't dramatic. There was no scream, no sudden disruption, no ambient chaos in the background, just a slow, steady breath. And then, Nathan's voice, quiet and composed, almost resigned. It's not over. They're still broadcasting. And then, nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. It didn't just mark the end of a recording, it marked the threshold of something unresolved, something that refused to be boxed into an ending. Analysts replayed the final moments of the tape repeatedly, parsing every fluctuation in Nathan's tone, searching for meaning beneath the words. They ran digital filters, amplitude analysis, and spectral dissection. But there was no hidden message, no background frequency, just static. The same untraceable, patternless hiss that had haunted the edges of his final podcast episodes. They tried to isolate the signal Nathan mentioned. Government tech teams, shortwave radio experts, even hobbyist analysts combed through band after band, logging thousands of hours in the days after the tape went public. But whatever had been broadcasting, if it ever had, was gone. There was no origin point, no spike in activity. It was like the frequency had disappeared the moment his voice stopped playing. Still, it wasn't the technical data that captured people's attention. It was the message, the simple idea that something was out there, listening, transmitting, waiting. Nathan's name exploded across online forums. Subreddits dedicated to lost media and unsolved cases pinned his story for weeks. YouTube creators speculated on the final recordings, linking them to other mysterious disappearances in the American Southwest. Podcasts he once admired began dedicating entire seasons to his research. They played his voice in their intros, shared timelines, dissected maps. Amateur sleuths started their own investigations, forming digital coalitions to follow up on leads that law enforcement had long since dropped. It became more than a cold case. It became a movement. But none of them could answer the question that haunted Julia Barlow most. Where was her brother? The discovery of the tape had given her a voice she hadn't heard in 19 years, but it hadn't brought closure. Nathan's body was still missing. His last known location was still speculative. No confirmed sightings, no usable DNA. No witness testimony beyond the disappearing edges of a story most officials no longer wanted to touch. The case remained marked as inactive, not closed. A subtle but important difference. Legally, he was presumed dead. Emotionally, he remained missing. Every now and then, a tip would come in. A man spotted hiking alone near Section 34. A voice heard on a ham radio channel repeating similar coordinates. A scrap of clothing found in a dry wash 30 miles from Deadline Gulch. But nothing ever stuck. Forensic teams followed up when they could. Sometimes local PD would take the lead. But more often than not, those reports led to dead ends. And the more time passed, the more reluctant agencies became to pour resources into a case that seemed to have devoured every trail. The relay station was demolished 6 months after the tape was found. The structure had been too unstable to preserve, and what records it held were already in evidence. The lot was flattened, the debris hauled out. What remained was just scrubland and silence, but even that didn't stop the stories. A new generation of podcasters began picking up Nathan's case, some inspired by his work, others chasing his legacy. They named their series after his sign-off. Don't Follow the Noise. One podcast team attempted to recreate Nathan's original route, documenting the process from Motel to Gulch to relay station. They found nothing new, but their listenership skyrocketed. Downloads soared past 1 million in the first 3 months. They ended the season on a cliffhanger, claiming to have captured a strange burst of static during a nighttime recording session near the ridge. They never confirmed its origin. Others tried to track the alleged desert signal itself. Using old analog receivers and patched-together software, hobbyists swept the bands for hours. One listener in Utah claimed to have recorded a looped voice whispering coordinates at 2:17 a.m. He uploaded the file. It was later revealed to be edited. The forum banned him, but the obsession didn't fade. If anything, the false leads made the true believers more committed. They argued that the hoaxes only proved something real existed, something worth hiding. The myth around Nathan Barlow only deepened. He became the subject of documentaries, graphic novels, even a dramatized streaming miniseries. Some called him reckless, others a martyr of truth. But those closest to him remembered something quieter, more human. A man driven by questions he couldn't stop asking. A man who didn't vanish because he wanted to, but because he believed he had to follow the story wherever it led, even into silence. One winter evening, nearly 20 years to the day since Nathan disappeared, Julia stood alone near the base of what had once been the relay station. She brought with her a portable shortwave receiver, an old model Nathan used to recommend to listeners on his blog. She turned it on and scanned the bands. Nothing. Just dry static. She sat for over an hour, waiting for a sound she knew likely wouldn't come. Then she whispered one line, the one that still lived in the final seconds of her brother's voice. It's not over. Because somewhere, maybe buried under dust, maybe drifting on an untuned signal, Nathan's voice was still out there, broadcasting from silence, waiting for someone to listen.